So now it is my privilege and pleasure to introduce our closing plenary speaker, Ethan Zuckerman. I think first, something we can all know from looking into the program, Ethan has the coolest collection of titles and affiliations that I've ever seen. He's a senior researcher at the Berkman Center at Harvard. He's a fellow at the Center for Future Civic Media at MIT. That sounds like fun. He's the co-founder of Global Voices, an international blogging community that showcases citizen voices. And he's also the founder of something called Geek Corps, an organization that sends IT experts into developing nations to work on various projects. Now, what you may not know from the program is that I know he's cool because although I've only known him for 2 hours, he's already hugging in the Kai tradition. So he's got that going for him. He also apparently has a small fluffy cat, so that's good. And he probably also knows Dana Boyd, and a lot of research, long trail of research shows that friends of Dana Boyd are definitely cool. He also didn't laugh or run out of the room when recently exposed to some Kai people singing. More on that later. Okay, Ethan's topic today has to do with the influence of social media and user-generated content on online discourse. So please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Ethan.
Hug at this point, right? I've known Wendy for 2 hours now, and I have to say they've been 2 of the more memorable hours of my life. So hi, everyone, and thank you for being here. And I'm really honored to be with this group. And I want to start by sort of explaining the instructions that I got before I took the stage here. Desney basically told me that at the end of Kai, the one thing you absolutely cannot do is present a paper. For the simple reason that you guys have just seen roughly 300 of them, most of which were really fantastic. And the last thing you want is 301. And so I've gone sort of completely in the other direction. I'm standing up here not to present my research, but to talk about a subject that I am absolutely, thoroughly unqualified to talk about. A subject that I actually know nothing about, less than nothing about. The subject at hand is cities. And to give you a sense for just how unqualified I am to speak about cities, I should tell you that I live in a town of 1,800 people, and it's really the only place I have lived in my entire adult life. So standing here and speaking to you about cities when most of you actually live in them has an irony that you can't even begin to appreciate if you don't live in a town where livestock outnumber people. But I'm interested in cities for the simple reason that we should all be interested in cities, because cities are our future in a very profound sort of way. In 2008, we crossed a Rubicon, and we suddenly reached a point where human population is more than 50% in cities. And if this doesn't sound surprising, it's probably because you live in a high development nation. So within the OECD, it's more like 77% of people living in cities. And right now, this urbanization, this incredible curve that's going on, is pretty much happening in the developing world. And you're watching people go from rural areas to move into cities like Lagos, Nigeria. And if you look at Lagos, Nigeria, and I actually spent a lot of time in Lagos, I can tell you that Lagos has some charms to it. It also has some problems with it. It stretches something like 40 miles. It can take you 8 hours to get from one side to another. It's incredibly cramped. It's incredibly dirty. The traffic is awful, the noise. But when you actually look at Lagos and you try to figure out why people are coming there, it makes a tremendous amount of sense. And the reason it makes sense is that if you're living in rural Nigeria right now, and you have the option of moving to Lagos, a bunch of things in your life are probably going to get better. You're going to get a better education, or at least you're going to have a better chance at it. You're going to get much better health care than you would get in a rural area. You probably have a better chance at getting a good paying job. And more than anything else, you're going to be less bored. And if that sounds like a lousy reason to leave, it's not, actually. If you look at Amartya Sen, the development economist, who put forth this theory that development isn't just about getting rich, development is about having more options in your life. That ability to move to a city and suddenly have more things to do, more films to see, more places to go, more stuff to buy, all of that is what people around the world are looking for, and it's helping explain why they're moving to cities, even if those cities to us look crowded and cramped and dangerous. The question for me that I think is worth asking is actually why people would have moved to cities during the great wave of urbanization that transformed Europe. So in 1800, sort of right before Charles Dickens's era started, you had about 3% of the global population living in cities. And over the course of that century, we went from 3% to 14%. And if you were trying to make the decision to move from a small town in England into London, here are some really good reasons not to make the move. The first is that the city had this terrible tendency to burn to the ground. So that Great Fire of 1666, we call it the Great Fire to distinguish it from all the other not-so-great fires. You know, there were so many fires that you literally had to name them. And whole chunks of the town would burn down. And in the Great Fire of 1666, you ended up with 200,000 of the 800,000 people in the city no longer having a place to live. And the truth is, one of the reasons the Great Fire was less damaging than it could have been is that the year before, 100,000 people had lost their lives to the plague. And the plague had been even worse because, as we now know, the plague comes from fleas which live on rats, and the way that the mayor of London decided to deal with the plague was to kill all the cats and dogs for fear that they were in fact carrying it. So by the time we get into 1800 and you're trying to decide whether to move from the countryside and move into London, the real problem is the water system, which is so bad that in 1851 you have a hot summer that is referred to as the Big Stink, where the city literally smells so bad from open sewage that Parliament picks up and leaves. So this is the backdrop of all of this. If you were living in a British city in 1850, your average lifespan as a male was about 26 years. If you were living in a small country town, your lifespan was about 57 years. So you might move to London for a lot of reasons, but it was absolutely not for your health. What it was for is, again, to have stimulus, right? So this is the Amsterdam Bourse. This is basically the birth of the market economy as we know it, shares being traded, shares of companies, so on and so forth. Amsterdam rises to prominence around 1600 based on the fact that it's a free state where people from all over Europe can come together, they can worship freely, they can trade, you can interact with a really wide variety of people who you're never going to find anywhere else. And you may not always like them, you may not always get along with them, but all the intellectual and fiscal stimulus that comes from being together in the same place is now in this building in Amsterdam. If you make your way to Amsterdam, you have found a way to become a cosmopolitan. Now, I want to pull this word apart a little bit because we hear cosmopolitan and we generally think either of a fruity drink or we think of some jerk who's sort of jetting around the globe and, you know, looking down on everybody. But cosmopolitan actually has sort of a remarkable and wonderful meaning to it. It's the philosophical stance of affirming yourself as a citizen of the world. But when you pull the word apart, it's literally deciding that the world, the cosmos, is your city, your polis. And the guy who coins the word is this guy. His name is Diogenes of Sinope. And Diogenes is a bit of a trip. When I think about this guy, I generally think of him as the old dirty bastard of Greek philosophy. This is a guy who gets thrown out of his hometown of Sinope in Turkey. He makes his way to Athens, the big capital of the time. He can't find a place to live, so he lives outdoors in the agora, in a barrel, and he gets referred to as Diogenes the dog for the simple reason that he lives in public. And when I say lives in public, I mean eat, bathe, breathe, shit, etc. in public, and so people think of him as a dog, and so they paint him with dogs, and they call him a dog, and so on and so forth. But Diogenes moves to the city to pick a fight. He's looking for the ability to argue with the best intellect of his generations. He goes in, he faces off with Plato. You know, Plato says we define a man as something that stands upright on 2 feet without feathers, and Diogenes comes in with a plucked chicken and says, I have brought you a man. And so then Plato comes back and says, well, men also don't have long nails. So, you know, he's looking for intellectual stimulus, the sort of intellectual stimulus that comes from being in the center of a lot of different people who are viewing the world and thinking about things a lot of different ways. And when he says that he's a cosmopolitan, he's affirming something that sounds easy and something that we all aspire to. But at the time that he's saying it, it's incredibly radical. He's basically saying, I'm not an Athenian, so don't treat me as an Athenian. I'm not a Sinopean, don't treat me as a Sinopean. You're going to have to deal with me as an entirely different category. You're going to have to deal with me as a citizen of the world, as someone who's looking for these influences, these different ways of thinking from all over the place. It's very, very hard to actually live as a cosmopolitan until very recently. Kwame Appiah, who's a brilliant Ghanaian-American philosopher, points out that 300 years ago, we all, or most of us all, would have been living in rural areas. We probably would not have met people who had different religious beliefs, different beliefs on how you organize society, spoke different languages, had different cultures. We simply would not have had that chance. If you wanted that chance, if you wanted to have the ability to mix with people who view the world very differently than you did, like weird, unwashed homeless people who yelled at philosophers, you had to be one of that 3% who moved to a city. And Appiah argues that the reason we're so lousy at getting along with people who don't see the world the way that we do, the reason that we strive for things like tolerance rather than actual communication or acceptance, is that in the grand scheme of things, this stance of cosmopolitanism, this chance to be a cosmopolitan, is a very, very new thing. It's a very young thing. It's something that becomes possible literally with the rise of the city. Because cities basically are telecommunications infrastructures. There are a lot of different things. They're markets, they're machines for living, but on some very basic level, they are a communications infrastructure before we can communicate over long distances. If you're not able to have access to a printing press, if you're not able to have access to the phone system, to the internet, so on and so forth, one of your best bets is to organize a bunch of people in a room and have the ability to talk to them. And if you want to be able to talk to people from a bunch of different backgrounds and try to persuade them, or even better, if you want to have that opportunity to listen to people from a bunch of different backgrounds and try to get their input, you need a physical place that makes that possible. Part of what goes on in the city, and part of the reason the city is so appealing to people through history, is to be at that place where you're able to get different stimulus, different ideas, different perspective. And this is why I don't think it's surprising that in the late 80s and the early 90s, when people are trying to figure out how do you portray the internet, how do you portray online spaces to a naive audience that hasn't looked at it, not an audience like this, but a general public audience, what metaphor do you end up using? And both Neil Stephenson and William Gibson reach for the same metaphor. They reach for the city. And when you think about this from an HCI perspective, it's a terrible metaphor. Right? They're designing these worlds in which people have avatars that are sort of forced in together. They have to bump up together. You've got the possibility of sort of an infinite digital space. There's no reason that data has to be represented as having all of us together in the same space. But when Gibson and Stephenson are both thinking about what's exciting about the city, they're thinking about this battle for attention. They're thinking about how people are trying to capture your attention against a wave of noise. They're thinking about creating spaces where people are interacting with one another. They're bumping up against each other. They're sharing ideas. They're finding ways to knock things off one another. And so they both reach for the same sort of metaphor. And the reason I think they do this is that on some level, we understand that cities are tools for serendipity. The reason that many of us look for the opportunity to come to a city is to have this opportunity to get the influence of the people that we randomly bump into, to see something out of the corner of our eye that was completely unexpected, but leads us to discover something that we didn't know that we wanted to find. So the question that I want to ask at this point is whether this is actually true or not. I think this has historically been one of the draws of cities. I think when people think about why it makes sense to live in a city, this is one of the things they think about. But I also think to a certain extent it's a little bit of a lie. And this is why. This is a map that gets put together by a French sociologist in 1952. He does this gorgeous piece of research. Paul-Henri Chabartelot goes out and builds this amazing volume about Paris and its surroundings. And he creates a whole wealth of maps, and this particular one is interesting because he asks a graduate student, a political science student, to keep a journal for an entire year. And in this journal, she writes down what journeys she takes throughout the city of Paris. And they start at that circle, which is where she's living, and over time they sort of inscribe the Paris that she knows. And you can't really see it on this map, but I've sort of highlighted it and drawn it out a little bit. You end up with this triangle. And basically the vast majority of her trips are to the university where she studies, to the piano teacher where she studies piano, and back home again, in some sort of variant of all of this. And this doesn't actually sound all that familiar. There's a lot of sociologists who talk about home, work, and the third place. The thing that we do because we like to do it, it's our alternative to the two other places we have to be. But he looks at this and he says, look, the real Paris that we live in is incredibly narrow. We all constrain the city down to a very small number of places out of all the possible places that we could go. And Guy Debord comes and looks at this work and he basically says, this is pathetic. This is miserable. This should be an insult to us. Debord actually builds an entire practice based on wandering around cities, based on his shock at how pathetically limited this young woman's life is. Debord's kind of a jerk, actually, because the truth is, we're all pathetically limited. And in fact, if you take a close look at your own life, you do this wherever you live as well. So here's a much more recent map. This is a map put together by a guy named Zach Seward. Zach is the outreach editor for the Wall Street Journal. And he's sort of professionally an adopter of new technology from a consumer point of view. And over 2010, he spent an enormous time on Facebook. And he took all his Facebook check-ins for the year and he put it up on a map. And you can start looking at this. And the first thing you can do is you can pretty much figure out where he lives. He lives up there in Williamsburg, and he tends to sort of shop and go out in places just immediately south of it. You can see that he works in Midtown, Wall Street Journal's offices. It's right at the center of that heat mark. If you go down, you can see sort of a third spot, which is in the East Village, which is clearly where he sort of hangs out with friends. If you start looking at this more closely, you can actually find out a lot of other things about the guy. You know, for me as a Massachusetts guy, this is very hard to use because I'm able to figure out pretty quickly that he's a Yankees fan. The only place that he checks in is in the Bronx, and it's Yankee Stadium, and he's checked in there 2 or 3 times. The thing that may not be completely obvious is that you can tell from the map that he's white. And one of the ways that you can make a guess at this is if you start overlaying his data on top of a census map that gives you a sense of what the racial composition of his corner of Manhattan looks like. And his check-in points line up remarkably well with blocks in Harlem that are majority not African American. And in fact, the parts that are majority African American, he just seems to steer away from. And in fact, if you go back and look at this, you can see the only corner of Manhattan that he doesn't regularly go to is pretty much the one corner of Manhattan that's predominantly African American. Now, here's the thing. I mean, Seward's not a racist. He's also not, you know, like Debord, pathetically limited. He's just like the rest of us. We all have to find a way to filter our existence when we encounter something as broad and varied as a city. We think of ourselves as roaming very, very widely. If we actually look at our behavior tends to be pretty narrow for the simple reason that it has to be pretty narrow. And if we start looking at the patterns within that narrowness, we start finding out something that's a pretty basic sociological truth, which is the truth of homophily. And homophily is basically the discovery, and you know, only sociologists, you know, take truisms of modern life and then figure out how to statistically prove them. But homophily, in 1954, Lazarsfeld and Merton came up with a pretty good way of saying birds of a feather flock together, and then did 30 years of statistical research to give us pretty good evidence that, in fact, this is what happens. They started doing research in small communities, and they looked at who people built friendships with, who were the people that they confided with. And in general, the way people make these very strong social bonds of actually talking to people about their deep hopes and fears and problems, they tend to break down on racial lines, on religious lines, on socioeconomic lines, on gender lines. You pick a way that human beings can align ourselves, and we will generally find a way to do it in our own behavior. And I don't mean moment to moment. We can all come up with counterexamples. We can all come up with friends of other races and other religions. But in the overall pattern, there seems to be a general tendency towards finding ways to spend time like with like. And we know this happens, and in fact, a lot of our language about how we talk about cities reflects this. We talk about neighborhoods as having ethnic characters. We talk about ghettos, and you start looking at a map like this one put together by Bill Rankin. Bill, in this case, took a map of Chicago, and he took census data, and he looked at the ways in which people self-identified in the 2000 census in terms of ethnicity. And you end up with these very, very clear distinctions between white neighborhoods in the north, black neighborhoods in the south, little belts of Hispanic neighborhoods, and the incredible starkness of the division between these neighborhoods in Chicago. Literally, for all you UC people, you can watch Hyde Park as this little sort of sea of white that comes out in the midst of the blue on sort of the South Shore there. Chicago is really, really stark, in part because you have not just human tendencies for where people flock, you also have a city that over time has reinforced it. You have both individual decisions and you have structures that have led to this sort of homophilous pattern of how people find themselves interacting or not interacting. And so the reason that I bring this up is that I'm interested in this question of when we look at a city, when we look at all those options, all those possibilities for the random encounter, all those possibilities for input, how many are we actually getting? Are we living in a city in a way that's so limited that we're only getting a little bit of them, only a few of them? And the truth is, I'm not really interested in cities. What I'm actually interested in is this general question of what are we isolated from and what are we encountering? And this, finally, gets us into the space of social media, which I know is a little closer to what I do and a little closer to what I know most people in this room end up doing. So there's been this debate for maybe the last 10, 12 years in the social media space that tends to be referred to as the echo chamber debate. And it starts out with a really wonderful project from Pascal Chenet at MIT called the Freshman Fish Wrap, which is a very early form of a personalized newspaper. It actually prefigures a lot of cool things like Google News, but it's the idea that you could go in and enter in your favorite sports teams in your hometown, and you're going to get that news custom generated for you on a web page in 1992. And the idea is so cool that Nick Negroponte, who heads up the Media Lab at that point, makes it one of his key examples in Being Digital, which is a very influential book a lot of people read. And one of the people who reads it is a guy named Cass Sunstein. And so this is, wonderfully enough, it's an MIT-Harvard brawl, but, put that aside for the moment. Sunstein looks at this and says, the daily me, the idea that I can put together a newspaper that shows me what I want to see, that's not a dream, that's a nightmare. And what he's worried about is that we're going to end up in a scenario where we only hear the opinions we want to hear, we only hear the perspectives we want to get, we're going to get more politically polarized, we're going to get drawn apart, Republicans won't talk to Democrats, it's going to be awful. I think he's right, sort of, but I actually care a lot less about left-right than I care about us-them. And give me a moment to try to explain what I mean by that. People have been trying to disprove Sunstein for the last decade or so, and probably the best piece of work I've seen anyone do on it is Gentzkow and Shapiro. They write this paper out of the University of Chicago. They basically say, okay, we're not going to fight on you on the whole insulation, polarization stuff. We'll leave that for the moment. But the internet doesn't polarize us as much as you think, because it doesn't isolate us as much as you think. If you actually look at what news people are looking at, if you actually go out, you tag people as on the left or on the right, you look at what they're looking at, yes, there's absolutely media out there that is deeply partisan, deeply divisive, only Republicans look at it, only Democrats look at it, but honestly, that stuff is dwarfed by the big media sources. It's dwarfed by Yahoo News, by CNN, by AOL. That's where most people go to. Most people actually aren't all that isolated. Fine, well and good. What you may actually be ending up with is 90% of the population that isn't particularly partisan and 5% on either side who are yelling at one another, but let's give that for a moment. What struck me about this data, which they put together in this paper, and then Slate did a nice visualization of, is that Americans only really seem to interact with American media. If you take this, and I put little yellow highlights around the very, very few online news sources that Americans were going to within this. The BBC shows up, by the way, it shows up as pretty much the most partisan source on the map. Only 22% of the readers of the BBC are Republicans. So it's a highly polarized media. But then you have these other little itty-bitty bits of media. That's The Guardian, it's the Times of India, it's the Globe and Mail. Despite the fact that there's no extra cost to go to them, they're in English, they're as many clicks away as any of this other media, they don't make it into the American media diet. And lest you think that this is sort of an Americans are parochial, the world is global, actually Americans aren't nearly as bad as many other people on this. You can dive into something like DoubleClick Ad Planner and look to see what news and media sources are most popular in different countries. And what you end up discovering is that there is a massive bias in most nations over a certain size towards domestic media. Now, all the Canadians in the room can feel good for a moment or two, which is to say that you guys read about 40% local papers and about 60% international papers, but now you can feel bad again because the international ones you read are all from the US. And that's the pattern that comes out, which is that basically, if you are big enough or linguistically isolated enough, you read pretty much only your domestic media. If you are a smaller country bordering on another country, you tend to read their media, and if you're in Latin America, you just ignore everybody else. It turns out that all throughout Latin America, even in sort of similarly sized countries, the Chileans and the Argentines have no interest in each other's news, which I find utterly baffling, but it seems to be the way it happens. So a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last 6 years or so is basically trying to get people to pay attention to each other's media. And that's the work that we do over at Global Voices. And I'm not going to go into it, but it's an aggregator of citizen media. We've got 400 people all over the globe. They look at blogs, they look at videos. It's great. The reason I'm telling you this is it's had a lot to do with what I find myself paying attention to. And it's not because I'm religious about going to our site and reading it every day, because actually I'm not, which is sort of embarrassing. But what it's done is it has radically changed my social network. And what it means is that of these 400 people, probably 350 of them are my Twitter friends or my Facebook friends. And when things start to happen across the world, I end up with sort of an early warning system for them. So one of the things that was very obvious this winter, in early December, was that something very strange was going on in Tunisia. And while you guys may not have heard this story until pretty much the day Ben Ali stepped from power, those were protests that were taking place for about 4 weeks. And we happen to have a very big Tunisian contingent within Global Voices. One of our sort of vice presidents is a Tunisian dissident who's been out of the country for 13 years. And I would get these increasingly crazed messages from him essentially saying, why is no one paying attention to this? This is unprecedented. We have hundreds of people in these towns rising up, not just in the town where Mohamed Bouazizi lit himself on fire, but all throughout this country, a country with no independent media, with no tradition of public protest, where everything gets shut down by the state. You guys should pay attention to this. And on January 12th, I ended up writing a piece called What If Tunisia Had a Revolution and Nobody Noticed? And 2 days later, Ben Ali stepped down, which made me look really, really smart. But that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is actually that if you've got this sort of much more broad and diverse set of people, you are nowadays likely to get information that's very hard to get other ways. One of the things that was very interesting is that when my phone started ringing on January 14, some of the people who were calling were in the US State Department, who were trying to figure out what the heck had just happened. And what had happened is that we've had this shift from this sort of this unipolar world into a multipolar world, and all sorts of institutions, but particularly the military and the diplomats and the press, are still trying to figure out how to catch up with it. And to a certain extent, the only way to track this at this point, until you get the press caught up with it, is to try to find some ways to broaden how you're looking at the world. So I want to make the argument that a radically oversimplified sort of sense of what's gone on over the last 15 to 20 years of media is roughly summed up in this slide. We've gone from a world where a lot of the news and information we get is coming from skilled curators. It's coming from folks from the New York Times who know what they're doing and who have this almost sort of paternalistic role of saying, I'm going to tell you what's on the front page. Here are the 20 things that you really need to know what's about the world. And if you read this, you will be a good citizen. And to the extent that they do a good job, we end up being good citizens if we pay attention and we participate in this. And to the extent that they don't, we end up sort of falling behind. But one way or another, that model has changed. And one of the big ways that model changes is when search comes in there. And we can suddenly say, thank you very much, I'm not actually interested in Tunisia. I'm deeply interested in sumo wrestling, and I can now find out more or less all I want to about sumo. The problem that you end up with in that scenario is that while you find out an enormous amount of what you care about, you have a very high chance of missing something that you needed to know about, but didn't know about. You need serendipity. You need the ability to stumble onto information that is helpful to you, but you didn't know you needed to know. The way that we seem to be dealing with serendipity is through social media. We're basically saying, I don't know what I need to know, so I'm going to ask my friends what I need to know. And this worries me deeply. And it worries me deeply because of that homophily slide, which is to say it works really, really well if you have a really good, really diverse set of friends. And generally speaking, we don't. None of us do. My friends may be very, very diverse in terms of where in the world they come from, but they're not diverse in some other axes. They're probably not particularly socioeconomically diverse. There's a lot that we might lose if we try to replace serendipity with just finding out what our friends know. So first, serendipity. It's an amazing word. It's such a wonderful word that Merton, this amazing sociologist, wrote his last book on it. And the book basically traces the word back to a guy in 1748 who's looking for a way of explaining a phenomenon. It's the phenomenon of making an unexpected discovery based on having hidden sagacity, having deep, deep knowledge of something that allows you to make an unexpected connection. And he comes up with the term from this wonderful old Persian fairy tale about three very learned princes who take off and, based on their learning and knowledge and encountering a foreign land, make these remarkable discoveries. And because they are the three princes of Serendip, he coins the word serendipity. And when you think about serendipity, and if you're using the word the way it was originally intended in the 1750s, it's about discoveries that have a piece of chance, but a very large piece of knowledge. So something like the discovery of penicillin, where you have Alexander Fleming in a lab already, growing bacteria in petri dishes. The accident is that the penicillium mold falls into it. But the serendipity is that it's happened to someone who can actually figure out that it's got antibiotic properties and trying to figure out what to do with it. When we use serendipity to mean lucky chance, we're sort of missing two major things behind it. We're missing the fact that you need to be prepared to make the connection. And we're missing the fact that we need structures that make these connections possible. So back to the city. One of the reasons I think cities are a place to look as we think about serendipity is that people have taken serendipity seriously as a topic for discussion in cities, at least since the 1960s. In the early 1960s, Robert Moses, this incredible urban planner responsible for the whole transformation of New York, has a wonderful idea. He's going to build a huge highway across lower Manhattan. It's going to connect the suburbs in New Jersey with the parks that he's building out in Queens. All we have to do to get there is knock down 14 blocks of Broome Street. And unfortunately for him, Jane Jacobs lives pretty close to Broome Street, and Jane stands up and says, I'm not really interested in that. I think that you're missing the point. You're looking at the city from a bird's eye view, and you're looking in terms of efficiency. You're trying to get people from point A to point B as fast as you can, but I'm looking at this from a street eye view. And from a street eye view, I think you're missing the point of how cities work. Cities work because we have a whole bunch of people doing different things in the same space at the same time. We have people in this neighborhood who are living, who are shopping, who are looking for entertainment, and we're all occupying the same space. And by being forced to bump into each other and have these casual encounters, that's where we get the vitality that makes cities exciting. And Jacobs wins. There's no Lower Manhattan Expressway. And in fact, she actually sort of wins the battle for how we think about cities pretty much since then. And this entire movement called the New Urbanism, this movement for walkable cities, is all about finding ways to create these mixed-use spaces, to create these casual encounters, to bring people together in ways that may be slightly less convenient than getting from point A to point B, but enable the city to be alive in a way that it wouldn't be otherwise. Now, one of the great things about cities is that they're very hard to start from scratch. It's very, very hard to go in and say, I'm going to raise this neighborhood and start from scratch. Generally speaking, you have people pushing back, you have people preserving. And what this means is when we want to study cities, we've got old ones that we can go walk around in. If you want to try to figure out how to make Lagos better, you can go walk around in Rome or walk around in Boston and try to get a sense for how people have solved these problems. We suck at doing this with online spaces. We're really, really bad at it, right? I used to run an online space called Tripod. It was an early competitor to GeoCities, and I have no idea what it looked like. When I was building it, this space was really expensive. And I have a couple of stray bits of graphic design from it, and I sort of counted on the Internet Archive to help me out with it. But ultimately, I had 18 million people creating web pages, and there's a couple thousand of them in the Internet Archive, and the rest of it is just utterly and totally wiped out. And I'm not saying that the community that we created had any great insights for how you guys should create the future, but I am saying that we've hit a point where we simply have very little record of how many of these communities actually operated, and what worked and what didn't work. And so one of the things that I think we have to think about is continue thinking about how we preserve and how we learn from the past, as well as how we learn from other examples. But I think there's a lot that we can actually get out of real physical cities. And one of the things that I think we can get is the importance of being able to see what people want to do. Cities have all sorts of signals of how people use them. You can tell whether a street is abandoned or whether it's really full. You can tell the popular restaurants, the popular parks. You can tell literally where people want to walk and where people want to go. We seem to be very suspicious about doing this in virtual spaces. If you try to ask the question, who is the most popular person on Facebook? It's a remarkably difficult question to answer. Facebook certainly doesn't put it on the front page. If you dig into their directory and you sort of get down far enough, you can get into these directory pages that start giving you a sense for who is liked by more than 1 million people. And these can be very depressing in the sense that there's 21 million people who feel compelled to tell you that they like Vin Diesel. But they can also be very, very interesting in that when you go into this, you find a Turkish folk singer. You find an Indonesian pop band. You find an Italian motorcyclist. You find this underground Mexican sort of South Park-like cartoon. But you only find it if you sort of go in and you look for these signals. And one of the interesting things is that these signals turn out to be almost invisible. You go and look for these different things on the web, and they're very, very hard to find in English. These are other cultures that are going on that if you can see that they're going on, you can catch a glimpse and maybe find a way to learn more. Facebook, interestingly enough, has deprioritized this. They now have a different browser that basically says, let's try to find you content we think you will like. And if you go into Pages, you get something that looks more like this. And this one is customized for me. It has 2 pages I already liked, my project, my friend Craig Newmark. It's looked at my friends, and it's come up with lots and lots of Arab Spring underground groups. That's very exciting. You know, it's nice to see that this is, in fact, a mixed-use space. It isn't just sociability. It's also political activity. But this is incredibly highly personalized to me. I'm getting Egyptians and I'm getting Kenyans because I know a lot of Egyptians and I know a whole lot of Kenyans. If you don't know a whole lot of Egyptians and Kenyans, you get this. And this is what I got in Vancouver in my hotel room last night. And you can see it's already trying to figure out who I am. I've got Tim Hortons up there because it's figured out that I'm in Canada. But it's trying to figure out who I'm going to like, not necessarily who I would like globally or who I would like universally. I am very suspicious of any technology that's trying to hide those signals, that's trying to hide the fact that there are other people using the tool differently than I am. Twitter, for all that's good and bad about it, at least comes out and gives you the other tags that people are using. You get a glimpse at what sort of conversations are happening in public. You can see what's happening in the next neighborhood over. Whether you go over there and click over there, that's really up to you. And one of the things that are great about cities is that they offer you lots of ways to navigate through them. You can look at a map. And nowadays, you can look at a map that other people are starting to annotate for you. I suspect that it's days or weeks before you have someone doing good mergers of Facebook-like and some sort of geographic overlay. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's a bad thing if it's the only overlay. If my navigation through Vancouver is only from my friends, it depends a great deal on whether my friends know Vancouver. If I can swap through and I can have multiple people guide me through the city, if I can have Vancouverites, if I can have Japanese Vancouverites, if I'm particularly looking for something, the data overlay isn't the problem. The problem is figuring out how to get different groups who view things different ways to give me different tours through the city. And I can find ways to get guided through, whether it's a heritage tour or whether it's something else. We can annotate cities with different people or different groups offering us different ways to wander through. I'm also inspired by ways that people are trying to find to wander based by treating cities as game boards. I've been wandering around Vancouver because I'm a geocacher. And so I look for things that people have hidden in plain sight throughout the city. And by treating Vancouver as a game, rather than as a place to be, I'm finding myself sort of in different corners of all of this. And this, for me, raises questions about what would happen if we start treating online spaces in the same way, trying to get people to go out in different directions and to stumble. Now, I want to make the point that while I'm talking about cities, we're talking about digital spaces. And we're not locked into just one way things have to be. One of my favorite insights comes from my friend David Weinberger, who pointed out that books on a shelf can only be organized one way. It's a huge amount of money to mix them a different way, but there's no reason you can't offer different forms of proximity online. And in fact, he's doing this in a project over at Harvard right now. And what he's trying to do is mix that digital ability to remix and to shift, and to be able to say now by subject, now by author, but to take what's so great about physical books. We can tell a lot of things about whether a book is old or new, whether it's battered, whether it's really tall, which usually means that it has pictures, whether it's thick. How do we take the information that we're getting from physical communities in the physical world and take what's great about digital and the way to mix and start to put them together? So this is not a talk with answers at the end of it. It's a talk with questions. And it's the talk that I wanted to give to you guys because I'm sort of counting on you guys to help me figure out if these are the right questions. And if they are, where do we go with them? What might we get from looking at cities and thinking about this different definition of serendipity? How do we bring it into online spaces? How do we take this wonderful ability we have to put information on top of the world? And how do we do it in a way that the world gets wider rather than getting narrower? So that's the question that I need help with. And so I put it to you guys, and I'm grateful for the chance to come to you and take some questions, and I hope to get some answers. Thank you very much.
That was great. I'm going to walk over here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ethan. That was really inspiring, truly. If you have some more questions, please feel free to send those up to the front. I wanted to ask you a question, Ethan. I've been a translator on Medan.org and tried to, bring the voice of some of the Arab press to English speakers. But one of the frustrations I've found is that while I can translate the language, I can't then put it in the context, the historical significance and context of the references that are in the article. I can't find a way to easily bring that to the reader. Do you have any thoughts about that?
So the work that we do over at Global Voices, we end up translating in two different ways. So we do the literal translation, right? We take from Arabic to English, and then we go from English into 30 different languages. But we do something else that we call bridging. And bridging is trying to figure out how to take someone who's got the cultural context, both from, say, an Egyptian author and from, say, an American audience, and to try to know what that audience is going to know and what they're going to have explained for them. And what you'll find within Global Voices is we've got about 400 people, almost all of whom are not just bilingual, but in almost every case are bi or tricultural. And that gives them that ability to sort of straddle the gap between those cultures, because you're absolutely right. Language alone won't get you there. You need the context, you need the bridge.
Okay. So another question that came from the audience is, do you think a subset of the population that is open to, and maybe even searching for serendipity, can impact discovery for a larger population that is not or less open? So can it go viral, serendipity?
I think it absolutely can. And I think this is where social networks get incredibly powerful, is that I don't think you need everyone you know to get super excited about Tunisia or the Arab Spring. I think it's possible for us to each pick sort of subsets of the world or subsets of issues that we end up caring about, and essentially becoming advocates to our community for why we might take them seriously, and then use our own social networks to sort of spread them out. I think the responsibility in the other direction is to try to identify who in your social network are those advocates or are those cultural bridges who are trying to unlock some other part of the world for you, and then to try to figure out how to learn from them and try to figure out from them who you might want to listen to.
So what do you think about the criticism of some people that social media is causing a reduction in face-to-face, more tangible interactions? And do you think that serendipity online is going to feel the same as that kind of deep face-to-face conversation that you might have with somebody from a different culture?
I don't mean in any way to diminish the value of face-to-face. And we spend a lot of time within the Global Voices community talking about what we call VPV. You start a relationship virtually and it ends up being face-to-face, and then you go back to virtual. And that person-to-person bonds it in a very deep and important way. But I think the truth is, we're not really getting news from our neighbors anymore. How we interact in physical space has changed a great deal. And we're not getting news from broadcast media, we're getting it from online media. And if we're going to find ways to deal with the serendipity problem, this is probably the space where it needs to happen. In the long run, maybe it helps us change where we go and what we do. If you end up getting addicted to translating anime, there's a good chance that you're going to fly over to Japan at some point and actually start having that face-to-face. There's no reason it can't start in a virtual space and sort of work from there.
Okay, I've got another one. One audience member sees strong ties between your very cool themes and Stephen Johnson's Where Good Ideas Come From. Can you comment on this? Is emergence in your sights?
I will cop to reading Steve Johnson and enjoying a lot of what he talks about and what he thinks about. And he and I both had a chance to give similar talks at TED last year, and I think got some stuff back to back. I think one of the things that Steve looks at a lot is the borders between communities and the borders between disciplines and the borders between fields. And I think those are incredibly fertile places for the exchange of ideas. I think in general, lots of what we need to know these days is about going wider rather than going deeper. And I think a lot of what he's had to say in some of that recent work is about figuring out how broad your field is and where it starts to intersect with some of those other spaces.
So here's a related question for translations. Is there a way to overcome the language barrier without having to just give in and surrender all communication to one language, one form of communication, one point of reference?
Yeah, I don't think we're going there. There's been a lot of argument for global English lately, and I just don't buy it. And I don't buy it in part because I sort of made that assumption and sort of screwed it up in my own community. So when we started Global Voices, we realized we had to translate from other languages into English. And so we did, and we put a lot of resources into it, but we only published in English. And about 3 years in, our community started saying, you got to publish in other languages. So we put up other servers. We now publish in 30 different languages. I had no idea that we would end up with 30,000 readers in Malagasy. But then last year, we all got together in Chile, and the writers said, we don't want to write in English anymore. And we said, well, wait a second, that's kind of a problem, right? I mean, our editor speaks 7 languages, but she doesn't speak 30 languages. But we made the shift, and it turns out that our coverage of French-speaking West Africa is vastly better. And it just turns out that those folks want to write in French first. And so now there's French first, and then there's English. And so what I'm finding is even amongst highly wired, highly connected, highly cosmopolitan people, people like their languages. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I think we just have to get a lot better at doing what you're doing with Midam.
Okay, chair's privilege. I recently attended an NSF workshop on designing for citizen diplomacy, and I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit on your role, your view of the role of citizen diplomacy, whether citizens and grassroots sorts of activities across cultures can help create this kind of awareness and understanding that you've been talking about.
I think particularly in some situations, citizen diplomacy is one of the strongest tools we have. Which is to say, one of the reasons the U.S. State Department sort of had its hands tied is that the U.S.'s name is sort of mud in North Africa. And no one in those movements wanted to be associated with the U.S. government. But where people from the U.S. were really, really helpful, actually, was in mirroring videos, or providing server space, or finding ways for people to get online by calling up other people's servers. And by having those individual citizen efforts, there were a lot of very, very strong ties that ended up being built. But it was very much person to person. It wasn't a particularly organized thing. But it is one of those cases where I think individuals, in many cases, can be much, much stronger than governments at sort of reaching out and building those ties.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you so much.
Thanks, everyone.